Good afternoon at 3:32. Just a couple minutes late. I had some, not some technical issues, but I was sending you an email about the access of, so you could get in and look. We're going to talk tonight, as the slide here says, and I'm going to take this off for right now because we're not going to use slides for a couple minutes. The major portion, I won't say the major portion, but the first portion of tonight's audio and video lecture is on selecting, specifically selecting employees that fit. And that's very important. We're using this because the assignment that you have for next week is to submit a chart with narrative describing the key parts of the selection process. It's critical to understand the process and the steps in the process, but it is more critical, I believe, to internalize those. In other words, get them in, understand what's being said, so that when you are going through the process of selecting, and I hope that some of you will be HR practitioners are already HR practitioners, and you're learning some of the tricks of the trade, so to speak, or you're getting some input from people who are seasoned practitioners. The Cruz and Payne certainly are in the field. So these people not only have theoretical knowledge, but they also have practical knowledge. So these steps are very important for us to learn and to put them into practice when we're actually going through the selecting process, or helping hiring managers in the selecting process if we're working in HR, or conversely, if we turn out to be a hiring manager or currently a hiring manager, we understand the steps that HR goes through before they hand off the rest of the process, the hiring process, to us as a hiring manager. So this is a twofold thing. HR is going to do an awful lot at the beginning, and then they're going to turn the rest of the process over to you. So you have to understand the process as a hiring manager, but then you still have to rely on HR for technical expertise and help and making sure that you're staying up with the relevant rules and regulations set down by the EEOC. It's very important we get this right. If we don't get this right, we cause the whole process to start over, back to the recruiting, et cetera. And there's a cost here. That means that we're inefficient in what we've done, ineffective. Hiring the wrong person can cause department and company morale, depending upon the size of the company, to certainly take a nosedive. If we hire the wrong person, it's just not going to be good. We need to think about hiring people and how we do that and the processes we go through. Also, tonight we're going to discuss chapters 13, pardon me, staffing system administration, and then chapter 14, evaluating the staffing system. This course is titled Employee Selection and Staffing, but we need to understand the staffing, how to evaluate the staffing procedures and techniques used, and some policies, and we want to think about that along in that fashion, because if we don't understand that, then our understanding of the whole process of employee selection and staffing is really not well understood. So we need to get a grasp of that. Now we're going to begin by talking about selection, and as we know, it is selecting the best candidate or candidates if we have more than one opening from a pool of qualified applicants. Now, if we want to move that a step further, although I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but that's okay, we're talking about selecting from a pool of qualified candidates. But as far as I'm concerned, and I'll repeat this again, applicants don't become candidates until they go through a couple of initial phases of the selection process. Stewart and Brown, their original text on human resource management linking strategy to practice, which was published in 2009, said employee selection is a process that an organization uses to test and gather pertinent information from job applicants to determine the best qualified. There are two considerations in the selection process. And I think we have a slide here that's probably good to put up. We've talked a little bit about this in the past, well, I guess I need to blow that up. So we make sure we're getting the right person here. And that is, selection should be based on one of two factors. And of course, the factors can be put together. And this slide comes from the resources associated with the Stewart and Brown text. Two considerations: job-based fit and organization-based fit. Farmer matches, obviously, the candidate now to the job or with the job, and the latter matches the candidate's characteristics with the organization's culture. I believe that I have mentioned that Toyota does this, and especially for its middle managers and upper level management. They spend several days with a candidate, and notice I used the term candidate because that person has gone through the various phases and is now figured to be somebody who's up for the job, or at least going to be considered for the job. Toyota spends several days with these folks, in many cases off-site, to get some idea if they're going to fit in with the company and the company's culture and its values, etc. So it's a very important thing to do, this selecting process, and we can do either job fit or organization fit. Often what happens in the selecting process, an organization will find an individual who they don't believe is best qualified for the open position, but do believe the individual is a good fit for the organization. And so they'll look around the organization to see if there's other job vacancies which this person could fit. And if not, tell the person, we don't think you're the best fit for that position, but we think you're a good fit for the company, and we want to keep your resume on file, and we'll get back to you as soon as we have an opening that best matches your skills. Of course, that doesn't mean that that individual is going to wait around for a job offer, but at least it gives that person a leg up on some other people, and he could probably even use that as a bargaining chip with another company. I don't really think that's necessarily a good practice, but it does happen. Before we focus on the selection model that you can find in the text on page 161, it's important to note there are several other selection issues. First is the speed of selection. Normally speaking, a company has advance notice of an employee vacancy. In this case, I'm speaking of the hiring manager, and we'll consider the hiring managers to be a department head or department supervisor or manager, where he or she knows the personnel pretty well. They'll notify the human resource management folks that they have an impending vacancy for a number of reasons. First of all, they might have a vacancy higher and they're going to move somebody into that position. So that creates another vacancy. or they know a person is going to retire. Now, HR ought to know that too, but sometimes they don't. They may also know that a person is ready to take a job elsewhere because he or she feels that they can't be promoted where they are. They've got a better opportunity, whatever that happens to be. And of course, there may always be things like transfers, lateral transfers within either the department or the company, and of course, unfortunately, terminations. So we need to know how quickly the vacancy needs to be filled. So we notice that here companies don't always know when there's going to be a vacancy, which we've kind of talked about. If the position is deemed critical to fill, an abbreviated selection process may be used. That is not something that I think is a good idea. Although companies may have their collective backs to the wall and feel that they need to go through the process rather quickly. In this case, if you do need to go through this, you need to do targeted recruiting. And only a few steps in the selection process will be used. Now, what do I mean by that? If you use targeted recruiting, you're going to do some type, and notice I said recruiting because we have to recruit before we can select. What I mean by that is you will advertise for people in trade magazines or other type of trade official organs of some type, magazine, publication, something that's posted online, whatever the right thing is. Or you will go to, if it's an entry-level position, maybe you'll go to colleges and universities and try to attract people that maybe have a certain GPA, that they're in this kind of curriculum or something else. So you're limiting the field, and in that fashion, you're saying that everybody is qualified. So you'll omit the initial screening process, and you may eliminate the second screening process. So you would go into the candidacy. Another issue that's mentioned in the text is the probationary period, and I think I've touched on that before. This may be used in lieu of employment tests as an evaluation period. And during the evaluation, you're testing, quote unquote, testing the employee's skills and abilities, as well as judging his or her knowledge and other characteristics. 30 days I have seen to be a normal probationary period. I have seen them extended as long as 90 days. Now, there's a problem with 90 days, and that is why does it take you 90 days to figure out whether or not this person is a fit as opposed to 30 days? So what it kind of says there to you is, are you giving another probationary period after 30 days? And so if you, and I'm not saying this happens, but there is the possibility, if you would extend somebody out to 90 days and at the 89th day, you would say, we don't feel like you're a good fit, a person could come back and talk about wrongful termination and things of that nature. One thing I want to be clear to you is that if an organization does have a probationary period, it must clearly tell the prospective employee that he or she is being hired on a contingency basis. Well, that's wrong. Conditional basis. And that everything is satisfactory after 30 days, the offer will become permanent. Courts, this falls into what's known as the at-will law, employment at will. That is an old law that's been around for a long time, kind of seated in Western society, that states that the employment contract, whether there is an official contract that's signed or a contract that's agreed to, an offer and acceptance, And then, of course, there's remuneration, some kind of remuneration as well that's mentioned. That the employment contract, to go back to what I started to say here, employment contract can be terminated by either party, employer or employee, at any time for any reason. Courts have looked rather skeptically in recent years on this employment at will contract type thing, or provision, I suppose is a better way to say it. So it's always better to be upfront, say that this employment is conditional, and of course many times you make the employment conditional based on results of physical and perhaps drug screening as well, and many times conditional based upon the results of the background check. So this is just one more conditional thing that you're adding, and it's best to do that because you don't need to be in that issue or create that issue. Maybe it's a better way to say that. A final issue is that of the quality and quantity of the applicant pool. An organization can be very selective if the pool contains a large number of qualified candidates, but it cannot be in the reverse. If the organization is forced into the situation, the selection process is moot because it may show that some or all of the selected people will be poor performers. Now the text provides, and I want to I'm going to pay a lot of attention to my notes because it's really important that you get this. The text provides a selection equation that states whenever the ratio of applicants is below 1.0, the company has a pool of more qualified candidates than it has open positions. A ratio greater than 1.0 is just the reverse. So good selection procedures are necessary when the ratio is below 1.0 and of little use when it is greater. You can see this on page 163 in the text, but do not confuse it with the information listed on pages 75 through 78, because here we're talking about adverse impact and etc. So we don't want to get into that. Please don't get those two confused with each other. Two separate issues. And notice again, when the ratio is below 1.0, you have more qualified candidates. So the selection process talks about it is really a little use because, well, that's probably a bad term to say, even though I have that in my notes. It's not going to be as effective because you have a great pool of qualified candidates. Now, yeah, you want to get the best of those qualified. But what you're going to find, and what this alludes to, is you're going to find the qualifications amongst these people so close that it's going to be very difficult to make a selection based upon some criteria that you have set up to weed people out, because that's what most are. Now the text has a notional, and I like to use that term, notional selecting process, the steps of selecting process, listed on page 161 in the text. You notice there's a number of steps that we go through, and you'll also notice that a person does not become a candidate until they get past what's known as secondary screening. So initial screening is where we want to start. Obviously that's at the beginning, and it's always the best place to start. Here this is, now remember, the recruiting part is over. And here HR folks have received applications and resumes, or both, depending upon what is asked for. Sometimes the recruiters will say submit a resume, and then an application is not filled out until after the resumes have been screened. But anyway, we're going to go through them. What we're going to find is if there are applications or resumes or both, many will be excluded at this step for a variety of reasons. Among them are they're incomplete, especially for applications not attaching a resume, and they do not meet minimum qualifications. And remember, that's what we want to make sure. We're going to talk more about this next week when we get to job analysis. We want to make sure that we are looking for people with minimum qualifications. We get to asking for people with qualifications over and above the minimum. We're asking for problems. This screening is usually accomplished by an HR specialist, not by the hiring manager. Although I do have in my notes are the hiring manager, but I would suggest to you it's usually done by the HR specialist, because the the hiring manager only wants to look at people who have met the minimum qualifications and they've been accepted by HR. The application form must be free from asking for inappropriate information such as race, gender, age, school graduation dates, military service, and military discharge status. In addition, the application should be consistent with EEOC guidelines. And you can see in your text, figure 8.2 depicts a sample form that meets EEOC requirements. Now, I want to just step here a second and check this out for you. You can find this, pardon me, 8.2 is found on page 166. Now, one of the things that you can do, if you'll notice in your text and look at your text, that it has a thing down here of, it doesn't have it right there, but there's a question that you may find on some, it is here, and I look for it in a different place. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? That is a legal question. You cannot ask, have you ever been arrested? And the reason for that is arrest has no bearing on eventual being brought to trial and conviction. And also we find that arrests for minorities are much higher than they are for the majority class. So you can ask, and this particular sample application does ask it, have you ever been convicted of a felony? That is a valid question that can be asked. I work for a small nonprofit, and one of our funders had a series of things that people would be disqualified for from working with their clients, and conviction of a felony was one. And so when I would interview people, I would ask the question, have you ever been convicted of a felony? If the answer was yes, then I stopped the interview and said, we can't go any further, and explained why. I had a gentleman come in there who was really very well qualified, and I would have offered him a position, but I asked the question, have you ever been convicted of a felony? He answered truthfully, yes, I have. And he went on to explain what it was, et cetera, et cetera. And I told him, I said, I have to stop the interview because I can't hire you. And it was a very painful conversation. And he called me later, 2 weeks later, and asked me what was, and I told him, I said, I mentioned to you that I couldn't hire you. I've done some checking, and your background comes back and says that you have been convicted of a felony. There's nothing I can do about it. Didn't like to have to go through that, but it's a very important thing. Due to legalities, the The following information should be included on the job application. That the employer has an at-will policy. We talked about that before. As employment can be terminated anytime by either party, as I mentioned. This doctrine, at-will doctrine, dates to the 19th century and is based on, again, both parties being free will actors, if you wish, and they enter into an implied contract, not written, and they can terminate that at either time. The EEOC has specific criteria for at-will terminations, and again, as I mentioned before, courts have narrowed the scope. So you need to be sure you're on solid ground with that. It wouldn't hurt you to call the EEOC and ask about it and get good information. So I'm not going to discuss this any further other than to say it's good practice for organizations to make employees aware of this policy. I said it before, you put it on an application. You can tell the employee during the interview, make a note of it. Yes, I told the employee or the potential employee that we did have at-will, and he or she is aware of that. Drug and alcohol screening has become a huge issue for employers. A different course that I teach and the text I use talks about it being an $11 billion a year issue for companies in the United States. Lost production, lost time, and things of that nature. But this is another issue where you have to tell the employees or potential employees that you do have this policy and that if he or she submits to drug and alcohol screening, which they're going to have to if they wish to be employed, and you have to tell them about that, that if it comes back positive, that they won't be hired. Physical examination is also something or other you need to tell employees or potential employees that employment is contingent on passing a physical. Again, this is something they need to be made aware of. You should always ask for permission to conduct background tests. We use them on a routine basis, but it's best to get employees' consent. And then finally, a statement on the application that any false information is grounds for disqualification or termination after a job offer has been extended and accepted. Resume analysis is a critical part of the initial screening process. Reviewers are often under the mistaken assumption that all information provided on a resume is accurate. The text points out that this is an error. Really, people ought to think about that, but they don't. There's some red flags that you can look for. Employment gaps, taking positions of lesser importance, or pay, inappropriate certifications, attendance, and diplomas from obscure schools, and poor use of grammar, including spelling mistakes. The resume, should paint a positive picture of the applicant, detail contributions to previous employers, the community, etc. Be logical, well-written, and highlight specifics, not generalities. Using the internet to post a resume, of course, presents issues. So the applicant must be aware of them and take necessary precautions to assure the resume will appear in proper format. Now, I have some information about resumes, but I want to let that go until we get a little bit later in this part of the lecture. Sort of do it as a culminating piece of information for you. And by the way, and I'll put this in the email that I sent to you about being uploaded. The information I'm going to provide to you is not in my lecture notes because I've just come in possession of it. I'm using an additional resource with this course. I haven't been able to incorporate everything I want to incorporate, but I have taken some things from that. And then some other things about giving an objective view and looking at internal or external applicants. And finally, I have 2 pieces of information from people who are business owners, or at least business CEOs, mostly of small companies. That comes from the Sunday business section of the New York Times. And what these 2 employers look for in candidates and questions that they ask. So I'm going to do this as kind of a wrap up to what we're going through here. Secondary screening, and you can see that in the text in that model we find on page 161. The screening interview is also a ruling out step, at least as far as I'm concerned. Applicant is interviewed again. Well, this screening is probably the first interview, so I need to change what I said here. This screening is probably the first interview. The initial screening is done to find out if applications and resumes that are submitted meet minimum qualifications. And it's usually conducted by an HR person, although it can be a combination of HR and the hiring manager. And the questions asked here are usually job related. So it's incumbent upon the person conducting the interview to have a copy of the job analysis along with the job description and job specification. And you'll do certain things like, have you ever operated this type of apparatus or equipment? Do you have experience in this position? Do you have required licenses or certification? Those are not always required, but in some jobs they are. So you have to have them, and they need to be asked for, and you might even ask for proof that the certification or license is current. If the applicant, and remember I'm calling this person an applicant right now, is unable to answer or does not possess the needed requirements, the interview is terminated because there's no sense going on with it. It is possible during this step the interviewer may realize the applicant's not qualified for the position, but may be qualified for a different position within the organization. As you can see, it's critical that organizations have skilled interviewers at this phase of the selection process, because in this last instance that I mentioned, a potential good employee may be lost. If the applicant survives this interview, he or she is then sent to the hiring supervisor, where a more in-depth interview is held as part of the secondary screening phase. So if the person is passed along to the hiring manager, he or she really is not considered a candidate at that time, although we could use the term potential candidate because they've gone through a couple of gates. There are several other criteria that interviewers use in the screening process. One is evaluating the biographical and background data provided. Note that one study by Harvey Cook, in other words, that's Harvey-Cook, a hyphenated name, and Tafler, published in the Journal of Occupational and Organizational Psychology, 73 and 2000, pages 103 to 118, states that biodata provided on a resume is a good predictor of success for entry-level positions. Furthermore, Cascio, noted in Applied Psychology and Personnel Management, second edition, published in Reston, Virginia, and by the Reston Publishing Company as well. Pages 192 to 193 says, one organization stated that college standing, that's academic rank, let's say there were 300 students in your graduating class, of course that would be from a small college, or let's say 1,000 from a larger college, was more meaningful than the college attended. meaning that the individual's rank was more critical than what college he or she went to. Organizations also use what's known as a weighted application blank, WAB. You can see that in figure 8.3 in the text. Here are years on the job as a variable that predicts success on the job. Other variables are also used, and each one is given a weight. These forms should be designed by knowledgeable individuals, usually an industrial psychologist. There's some debate as to whether or not the WAB is a valuable tool. And then employment testing is also part of this phase. Now, I believe I pointed out in the past, but in case I haven't, I want to point it out now. And if I have done it before, I want to reinforce the point. And that is employment testing must be job related, although there are some psychological tests given, and I think a few things of that nature. Psychological tests are usually given to see measure people's critical thinking ability, and that may be important in managerial level positions and maybe some other positions. Pardon me. But testing itself, it's again should be job related, and the data available say that testing will show more often than not people who will not be successful on the job. It is not necessarily a real good predictor of who will be successful on the job. But certainly if it rules people out, you should be a step ahead of the game. Candidacy, or the employment interview, is the next step. Other than testing, the employment interview is the most commonly used selection procedure that most job seekers encounter, and it is considered a test. Now, I'm going to gloss over a little bit of interviewing tonight, and we'll spend a greater amount of time on interviewing in week 7. In this stage, candidates may be interviewed by the hiring manager, probably most often are. A panel goes through assessment tests or an assessment center. Assessment tests and centers are geared to gauge a candidate's suitability for a position and usually are reserved for at least middle managers, if not for upper management exclusively. If you use an in-basket exercise, for example, which is part of an assessment center, the candidate receives a number of actions, if you will, on paper. It goes into his or her inbox. And then the people who are evaluating what he or she does look not only at the speed at which the person gets through his or her inbox, but the quality and comprehensiveness of the responses. However, assessment centers are very expensive, and the people there who are to assess what the job candidate does and how well he or she performs need to be very well schooled, not only in the tasks to be performed, but also in assessing what a person does. So I said we'll focus on the interview. Interviews fall into 2 categories, either structured or unstructured. According to Ivancovich, in his Human Resource Management 9th edition, published in 2004, research has shown that structured interviews are generally more valid and reliable than those that are not. During the structured interview, the interviewer uses a predetermined set of questions which also have scores attached to them. Another purpose is to use objectivity, which a structured interview will do. It's because it removes potential bias. We're talking here about interviewer bias. And it should remove concern that women and minorities are disadvantaged during the interview. It can also assist the organization in case of legal action. So let's look at just a little bit here on the interviews. One of the things we have to ask, and is always asked, is the interview both reliable and valid? In other words, reliable meaning will it give us consistent results time after time after time, and valid meaning does it measure what it's supposed to measure? And here we have a process here is the process legal? Making sure we are fair and consistent with the questions. Is it acceptable? How does the employee, excuse me, the potential employee, how does he or she perceive the selection procedures that we have gone through? Now, these are the three most common methods used. We've talked about a couple of these. We're going to talk here about testing. Again, notice here with this slide, we talk about measures knowledge, skill, and ability. Now, there's some that tell you that you have to stay away from personality tests. Notice that's listed down here at the bottom, and the Myers-Briggs is probably the best known. But there's some more recent data that says personality tests that do have some value because they can be job related. They're looking here for critical thinking skills and things of that nature. And so you probably wouldn't want to use a personality test for a person who's a line worker. That's not to put that person down, but what it is to say is that we don't have to measure certain things for the person there. So there is data that says you should stay away from these. There's more current data that says they have some value. The best thing to do is to get advice before you administer something like that. Now, again, I'm going to talk, these are the tests. Remember, there may be situational judgment tests, maybe physical fitness ability testing. Certainly those things are already important. And integrity testing, something very important for people who are working as cashiers or otherwise handling money, and have been found to have great value as well as great reliability for people who are looking for these. Now, when you're going through information, you're trying to get information on a potential applicant after it's already gone through, you're going to use the applications and resumes, etc. Notice at the professional level, you're usually looking for a resume, although once some of the selection procedures have been followed or processes have been followed, you may ask the employee or the potential employee, excuse me, I'm jumping ahead of the gun here, to fill out an application because you need an application on file. Now, as I mentioned, I'm not going to speak too much about the interviews. We talked about structured interview versus an unstructured. Structured questions are already preset. Unstructured interview is where the interviewer just winging it is probably not the right answer, but that's kind of what he or she does, and seeing how people respond and react. I don't want to take up too much time in the interviews other than to tell you they are important because we're going to talk about this in week 7. Just know we have several different kinds of interviews, which I'm going to I'm going to spend more time on. We talk about structured versus unstructured. We also have a situational interview and a behavioral description interview. The situational uses hypothetical questions, and the behavioral description interview asks the candidate about actual situations encountered in previous positions and how they would act or react if a similar situation was presented to them. Uh, we're always concerned about interviews not being consistent. There may be bias that creeps in and things of that nature. I have to be careful about stereotyping as well. But if the interviewers are properly trained and you have a structured interview to lead you through those steps, then that should not be an issue. Verification is step 4. Uh, and this is tricky and difficult step for almost anyone because you have to go through some problems. It's difficult because when you are looking at the application or the resume and you say to list 3 references, nobody's going to give you a reference that they think would give them a bad reference. I'll come back to that in a second. So you want supervisors listed. In that case, the potential for negative information does increase. Rational people understand that a former supervisor would or should not lie or provide malicious information about a former employee. So a lot of organizations will only state that the job seeker worked at company XYZ for this specified amount of time, what his or her position was, and perhaps salary. The reason that they take this stance is so they're not sued. But we find here that giving only positive information is not prudent, especially when the former employee holds a former employee presents, not holds, a potential safety risk. As is pointed out in the text, the California Supreme Court held a former employer liable and imposed damages when a newly hired employee assaulted a student. Here the former employer hid damaging information. This is an issue that continues. And it's not just this type of situation. It's situations with teachers and physicians and other professional folks that you don't normally think about. How you can overcome this is train employees on how to conduct telephone reference checks. Let the candidate know the type of references that you prefer. Tell outside recruiting agencies what type of references you prefer. And then keep the references in the loop by sending them follow-up letters thanking them for the information provided. Organizations can go a step further by using professional firms to check background information, go to Department of Motor Vehicles, check criminal records to further verify a background, etc. If the organization decides to use this type of tactic in reference checking, it must inform the potential employee or the candidate that that's what is going to happen. So regardless of what you choose to do, resume checking and background checking and reference checking is always somewhat risky. I'm going to continue this because I want to get this finished here and then come back. Well, I think it's 5:20. Let's take a break. Come back at 5:25. We'll wrap this up and then get into the staffing portion of tonight's lecture. So we'll come back at 5:25. Thank you. All right, 525, we're back. Now, the final step in the selection process is the job offer. You have to hope that your homework's done, completed, and it's correct, because obviously we don't want to start this process over if we hire the wrong person, or because we hired the wrong person. And of course, now we have to notify the unsuccessful candidates. And there are usually three ways to do this. But personal conference is one, telephone call is another, and then by formal letter. A personal conference is expensive, and it may not be practical due to distance, among other things. A conference, however, does allow the candidate to ask why he or she was not selected, and maybe also ask, how can I improve my interview performance, for instance. We don't see this often used in the United States. Telephone call is another, does offer some of the same opportunities as a personal conference. It is personal, and it does build goodwill for the company and should leave a good impression on the rejected candidate. And finally, there is a formal letter addressed to the candidate on company letterhead. It should be personal in nature and as positive as possible. Rejection postcards have been creeping into this, but they should never be used. That is very impersonal, and they're not private, obviously. And any goodwill the company is trying to get from the rejected candidate is immediately lost. Now, we talked about how we're going to notify the unsuccessful people. What are we going to do for the successful person? Obviously, we have to have, we're going to offer him or her a job, usually by telephone, but we have to have a fallback position in case that person has decided to take a position with another company. So, assuming we have more than one candidate, we need to rank order those candidates, and if the top candidate elects to go someplace else, that we can offer it to the next person. Tentative job offer usually is made by telephone. The formal letter will be followed up advising the employee of the offer is tentative based upon passing perhaps background check, if that's not already been accomplished, physical examination, and a drug testing. Once those are complete and the company receives satisfactory results, a formal job offer will be made. And that usually includes the start date, the position, the salary, and benefits. Possible that either the company or the candidate will want to negotiate start dates. That's quite prevalent. Postponing a start date may be necessary for many reasons, and the company has to understand that. Final piece in the process is employee orientation. It's important that employees be oriented not only to the company, but to his or her position and department. Failure to properly orient an employee will render the entire selection process as null and void. Now, let me give you some information that I gathered from the Henneman resource that I've used about both external selection and then internal selection. One of the biggest issues employers face is resume inaccuracies, according to Henneman. Resume Doctor, an online company that assists applicants in preparation, found 42.7 had significant errors in background checking agency, and a background checking, found 56% of resumes contained a falsehood of some type. Major areas of concern are inflated titles, inaccurate dates to gloss over job hopping and employment gaps, and finally, half-finished titles, inflated education, or purchased degrees. Now, Henneman also talks about internal selection, and he says that internal selection has some advantages. First, more data is available, and it's objective, or it should be objective. Selectee is known, and he or she has a track record. The selectee should have more experience and greater seniority. He or she knows the company and should have knowledge of requirements of the vacancy. Peer ratings are often used, and if a decision is based on peer ratings, vacancy fill, it should have greater acceptance, although there is a potential bias issue. Methods used to evaluate an internal candidate include performance appraisals, seniority and experience, and of course there would be something that goes along with performance appraisal and a few other type things, and promotion potential ratings. But companies must assure these methods are both reliable and valid. And finally, I want to give you the information I gathered from the New York Times in the last several weeks. I didn't use last week's because it wasn't appropriate. Marla Malcolm Beck, who is the CEO of Bluemercury, it's all one word, a beauty products and spa services retailer. The interviewer asked her, "How do you hire?" And she responded by saying, "I am the queen of the 7-minute interview. I have a framework. It's skill, will, and fit," which kind of goes along with what we've seen in the text. Companies, employees, can-do ability, will-do ability, and organizational fit. I asked, "What's the biggest impact you had at your last organization?" And she says it's important that someone takes ownership for a project they did, and you can tell based on how they talk about it whether they did it or whether it was just something that was going on at the time in the organization. Will is about hunger. So I ask, what do you want to do in 5 or 10 years? That tells me a lot about aspirations and creativity. If you are hungry to get somewhere, it means you want to learn. If you want to learn, you can do any job. In terms of fit, I'm looking for people who have some sort of experience with a smaller company. At big companies, your job is really one little piece of the pie. I need someone who can make things happen and is comfortable with ambiguity. Kristen Molnar, M-U-H-L-N-E-R, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, CEO of New Brand Analytics, a provider of social media monitoring. The interviewer asked, "How do you hire?" 2 questions I often ask people to get to the heart of who they are. First, What is your passion? The answer gives me a good sense of how they are, and it helps me understand how they're going to fit culturally in the organization. Second, what will your company think when you tell them you're leaving? The response can help you get to other aspects of the person. How will they work with others and how they are perceived? I pass those along because it is giving us a real update as to how some CEOs operate and how they go through the selection process and the questions that they use. So these are real people having real jobs and hiring other real people. Not that the text doesn't point that out, but you have to remember that in most cases this text will not use a specific example unless they have one. Pardon me. Chapter 13, the authors state that human resources administration for an employee begins when he or she is hired. And we're going to go through the different steps or orientation, personal actions such as promotions, resignations, and terminations. Yes, there are other personnel actions such as downsizing, layoffs, reductions in force, retirement planning, and providing references. I view those as being lumped into two separate groups and will therefore present them as follows. Orientation. This is very critical and I alluded to that when we finished part of the selection process, very critical to a new employee. Now here we're talking about a new employee and not an employee who has been hired internally to go to a different position. That employee does need to be oriented if he is going to a different or she is going to a different department. Yes, because they need to know those things. But if they're staying within their same department and they are just moving up the ladder of promotion, they don't need to be oriented. They may need to know a little bit more about their job. So we could consider that as some type of orientation, but not quite the same. So I always look at orientation as being twofold. One is being oriented to the company. And so the new person comes in and he or she, maybe they have more than one person coming in at the time. They go to the human resources department, and from the human resources department, they're usually escorted to a conference room or an auditorium or something like that. And someone or someones go through various company policies. Some tell the story about how the company was founded, maybe some talk about the company's heroes, maybe some talk about some stories that are embedded within a company's culture. And then, of course, they'll go through the various things of handing out forms that need to be filled out, and they'll talk about benefits and other type things. And then they probably will pass out the company employee handbook and maybe have some discussion about that, et cetera. Depending upon the size of the company, that can last from 1 day to 2 days to maybe 2.5. It could last a whole week depending upon what they want to cover and what needs to be covered. Very important. And usually, especially in larger companies, pardon me, the employee will be escorted on a tour. Be shown where the lunchroom is or cafeteria, where the locker room is, if they use a locker room, maybe where the fitness center is, assuming they have a fitness center. Many large organizations do have fitness centers. Any other type things that are really necessary for the employee to know about being oriented to the company. Now, that is very formal. And usually companies have set procedures that they go through in that type of orientation. The second part of orientation is orientation to both the job and the department. Now, perhaps it's better to say, well, let's start from the whole or from the greater, which would be the department, and move down to the specific, which is the job. And that's fine. And I think you'll find that happens a lot. So here, once that orientation to the company is over, a seasoned veteran employee from that department should come down, get the new person, and then take him or her, pardon me, around the department, introduce them to people, and maybe the supervisor or manager or whatever that person happens to be called, and get those things in and talk about, the inner workings of the department and how people interact with each other, etc. And then there should be some type of orientation to the job. Now, how that's handled is really up to the company. Sometimes it's on the job training, sometimes it's something else. On the job training tends to be on the formal side, but doesn't have to be. But this is very important that there's two phases of this orientation take hold, because the employee has to know that. So when he or she gets to the department, they should be given the job description. Oh, they probably already have one, but make sure they do have one. And in-depth discussion to assure the employee knows the job's parameters. While this is usually conducted by the employee's immediate supervisor, having a seasoned, well thought of employee to add to the discussion provides extra needed information and perhaps puts the employee at ease, because he or she is now talking to somebody who is going to be a peer. They're not going to work for that person or under that person's direction. They're going to work with that person. Stages in an effective employee orientation program should be guided by the following. This comes from Stewart and Brown. Provide realistic information about the organization and how the employee fits in. That can be done both ways. That can be done in the general orientation and in the specific orientation. Offer support and assistance to relieve the new person's jitters. Everybody comes to a new job and there's apprehensions. How am I going to fit in? Do I have the right skills? Even though that employee has been through the interview process and everything else, there's still some jitters. And then, of course, again, they have the new person supervisor and a well thought of employee from that department greet the person and take them to the new place. Promotions. This type of action, if you will, has a huge impact not only on staffing but also on morale. I believe, and this is me talking, that there should be really no surprises when somebody is promoted from the position he or she now has to a higher level position. I say that because promotions should be based upon objective criteria. All too often, however, they're not based on objective criteria, and those are the type of things that cause employee morale to suffer. So there should be some benchmark. People ought to know what the benchmarks are, because they ought to be aware of what they're being judged against. So there's some standards, etc. Now, yes, we use performance appraisals as a guide, and I mentioned that in the last hour, as a guide to help us determine promotions. And those are not open. Those are between the supervisor or manager and the employee. There's give and take during the feedback session, etc. However, there should be some criteria that people are aware of as to how they are selected for promotion. That there's another piece of that puzzle, if you will, that is not evident, and that is demonstrated potential for taking on the next higher position. Now, remember, when in the last hour we talked about using what is known as, peer ratings. And peer ratings are done saying, who you think is the best at this and who you think has potential, etc. The value of that is that you're being rated by your peers. And so that should be objective, but too often it's not. And so there should be some objective criteria. So if you're, remember, as we talked about that would be considered a test. and tests must be both reliable and valid. So what you would do here, and this would happen in large companies, is that you would have an industrial psychologist design a peer review form, and it would be based on objective criteria. Now, yes, there's always the possibility, and we cannot dismiss that bias would creep into that because Joe likes Sally better than he likes Susie, and he doesn't like Mary at all, or just the reverse. Mary doesn't care for Jim. She does like George, but thinks Bob is the best. So that does creep into it. Personality does creep into it. But if you can have a form developed that is as objective as possible, and people are rated against objective criteria and by their peers, and the criteria is published and people know them, you're going to be able to reduce personal bias to as minimum, or you're going to keep personal bias to an absolute minimum. Understanding is probably going to creep in there, but you have to be careful about that. HR folks really have to get involved in this once the selection for promotion has been made, because they may need to counsel the person who's been selected and then counsel the people who were passed over. You do these things on certain days. When I was in the Army, we never told people who were not selected for promotion on a Friday. We told them on Thursday. The people who were selected were notified on Fridays. So a lot of times you would see those people who were not selected, and they knew they weren't selected, had been informed, they would maybe take leave the next day. And a vacation day or a PTO day would be a civilian equivalent, because you didn't want to embarrass them. It's never good to make a personnel decision, which is either really good, promotion, or really bad, termination, on a Friday. Cannot always be avoided, but at best, you want to do that. Promotion recommendations, we know, usually come from the immediate supervisor, but again, if we can get those peer reviews or peer evaluations, whatever you want to call them, that's a good thing to do. Promotions may be harder to come by in the future. I don't know, the text points that out. I don't know how true that is. I think we'll just kind of have to wait and see the dynamics of the workforce and how it changes. What I can tell you is there is going to be a greater emphasis on people with higher education, whether that's a 2-year degree from a community technical college or it's a 4-year degree from a college or university that offers bachelor's degrees. Greater premium is going to be placed on that. And people who think that's not going to happen are being foolish. Now, I'm not going to say that manufacturing jobs are not still going to be around. And I'm not saying that some jobs that require a lesser amount of higher order thinking are not still going to be around. They will be. But many of those jobs today, and they will increase in the future, require or rely on people being computer savvy. We use computers now for manufacturing, pardon me, to aid in manufacturing. And so people just have to understand them. HR folks have to be prepared by having senior management buy into 2 personal enhancement programs. One promotes continued education and enhanced job learning opportunities and growth. Our promotion may not be an opportunity, but perhaps job levels can be created to provide additional responsibilities along with salary increases. One of the big issues that we're facing in the United States today is that while our economy has improved, the average person's salary, the average person, not CEO and not upper management, and perhaps not even middle management. But the average person's salary or wages have not kept pace at all. Now, fortunately, and this may be a little solace to people, fortunately, our inflation rate has been very low for the last few years. So it's not caused anybody a lot of issues. But what it is saying at the same time is that people have not been able to move forward with salary increases or wage increases. And then the second is the dual track that is specifically aimed at professional and technical people. The object is to advance in the field without having to move into management. Transfers, well, we all know what those are because it's neither a promotion nor a demotion. Purpose is to help, if it's done correctly, the purpose is to help the employee gain additional skills and experience. And of course, when he or she does that, it makes them more beneficial to the organization. And there should be some additional benefit of that to the employee, perhaps in a salary increase. Of course, transfers can be caused by layoffs, downsizing, and outsourcing. In these cases, the organization is trying to hold on to a valuable employee. An employee may, and of course, on the other hand, an employee may ask for a transfer, or it may be caused by friction with current employees or with management or something else. And then finally, an employee may be transferred because he or she is not promotion material for whatever reason, where he or she is currently. And keeping the person in that department because he or she is not promotion potential may be causing some morale problems with other people who are promotion potential but are holding the position the person cannot move into. Demotions. This is, there's no easy way to talk about demotions. This is usually because a person is a poor performer. Could be because of layoffs or downsizing. All that usually isn't part of the equation. Or sometimes it's done in lieu of termination. If it's done in lieu of termination, the employee needs to be told that he or she is being transferred to a job to which he or she is qualified, and to be given a second chance. Otherwise, he or she will be terminated. And of course, it can be considered as rehabilitation when you do that. If demotion is the fault of management, in other words, management promoted somebody to a position for which he or she was not qualified, it can't be seen as punitive. And that's management's fault, and management has to take the hit on that. So when that type of demotion is done, management has to say, look, we made a mistake, and you really weren't qualified for that job, so we're going to put you in a job for which you are qualified. What happens to salary, I'm not sure about, but the person should be allowed to keep the same salary for a period of time. Because otherwise we're doing things to that person we shouldn't have done in the first place. So there have to be sound demotion policies to be followed when and if they're necessary. Private meeting between the supervisor and the employee who is being demoted are necessary. It might be advisable to have a witness. I suggest human resource management. One of the reasons I suggest those folks is because they should know the legal ramifications. And if a demotion is based upon poor performance, that should never be a surprise. People should know that. They should have been counseled ahead of time. They should have been told what the proper performance was, maybe shown what it was, and perhaps being given a verbal warning followed by written warnings, and then going into either demotion or termination. Resignations. The company really should not be overly concerned with these unless the resignations are due to morale. If resignations are just normal things, somebody's looking for a better job, excuse me a second, and feels that he or she can't be promoted at the current company, that's okay. A certain amount of turnover at any company is something that's to be expected. You really have to be concerned when it gets beyond expectation. Remember also that resignations, you should have a exit interview, but understand that the employee who is leaving due to resignation will not always be as truthful as you would hope that he or she would be. However, they still should be conducted, and the authors of our text provide some information about exit interviews on page 290. Again, as I said, some employee turnover is considered acceptable. However, too much is not good, obviously. The Bureau of Labor of National Affairs, which is part of the Bureau of Department of Labor, publishes a quarterly report on turnover by industry, and companies can compare their experience and use the turnover by industry as a benchmark to find out if they are doing better than the industry benchmark or they're not doing as well. Why do employees resign? Or why do they just leave the organization? That's usually resignation. Of course, there is some termination and there is some retirement, but we're talking about employees who voluntarily leave the organization. There are a number of reasons. Poor supervision. This is either because the manager or supervisor doesn't know his or her job, doesn't know how to handle people, and is the cause of poor morale because of poor interpersonal actions. I should have said that a different way. Poor personal interactions or poor interactions with personnel. Companies need to provide training for managers to make sure that they are interacting with their employees or with their staff, however you want to put that, the way people should be interacted with. Employees should be treated as what they are, human beings, and nothing less. If you have an issue with an employee, you take the employee off to the side or into a private room and talk about it. You don't make that employee a character that held up to everybody. Don't do this. That's just, you don't do things like that. According to Schermerhorn, who is the author of, and his associate author of Organizational Behavior, 12th edition, managers must maintain social capital, which is the ability to accomplish tasks by fostering interpersonal relationships, obviously good interpersonal relationships. Supervisors who do not have good human interaction skills need to be replaced. Monotonous work. Well, that can be addressed as using tactics. That can be fixed. Let me say this. Corrected is a better word. By using such tactics as job rotation, job enlargement, and job enrichment. Job rotation is exactly what it says. Person rotates from job to job. We talked about that a little bit before, where a person may be demoted because of reasons of layoffs or downsizing or something of that nature. You're moving a person to a different job to learn other skills. Job enlargement increases task variety by combining into a job additional tasks that were performed by two or more people. Nichols, McHugh, and McHugh in their 2013 13th edition, pardon me, of Understanding Business, say job enrichment is a motivational tool by providing the employee a greater challenge. In this case, the job takes on additional content, and the employee is responsible for planning and evaluating duties formerly done by the supervisor. it has the following characteristics: job enrichment, high task significance, autonomy, or freedom for the employee to complete his or her tasks at his or her discretion, and feedback, that is telling the employee how well he or she is doing. Poor morale usually comes from several different areas. It comes from lack of promotion opportunities. It comes from poor supervision. It comes from a routine, mundane work that doesn't seem to get any better. It comes from where employees are not empowered to act. All sorts of things. So you need to, first of all, get the supervisor or manager attuned to what's going on, hold sensing sessions to find out what can be fixed, and ask for ways to improve morale. Other reasons: inadequate compensation, lack of promotion opportunities, and other type personnel issues. These can be addressed on a company-wide basis, and it's best when those things, pardon me, crop up, that there's sensing sessions held, so we can get a good idea of what's happening. But if you're going to hold a sensing session, you have to get back to the employees, pardon me, and say, here's what we found, and these are the steps that we're going to do to implement changes to improve morale. Terminations. The reason for any termination must be documented. Termination should be held in private between the supervisor and the employee, and it must focus on work and on tasks not completed and things of that nature. And it should only focus on that and not the individual, him or herself. Now, there could be that the employee is guilty of miscreant behavior or deviant behavior, where he or she is doing things that cause harm to the company, doing damage to finished product, doing damage to machines, and equipment, and things of that nature. So regardless, the discussion should be focused on, in one case, behavior, on another case on task performance, depending upon what the reason for the termination. Conference is held in private to give the employee time to make comment, thank him for the comment, then he or she is to be escorted back to the workstation. You're supposed to collect security badges, codes for the computer system, personal codes for the computer system, and then the employee is supposed to be escorted off the premises. That works very well for large companies. Small companies need to think about that, how they expect to handle terminations, because some people do this, think of it, one of ways to get back at the organization. We read too much of that in the paper and see too much of that on television. And so we need to figure a way out. And finally, as mentioned here, same way with promotions, termination should never be done on Friday. Of course, that's not always possible, but for the most part, they should not be. Retirement planning. Even though the employee knows he or she's going to retire and has given notice, there's some things they need to go through. They need to understand what their pension is going to be, what their eligibility for Medicare is, what their Social Security payment will be. Are they welcome to come back to the company? And so there should be some process the company goes through to help the employee through that life-changing event. It is traumatic. Many people identify with the company they work for and job they hold. And so that there has to be some break there to show people how to get over this process. One of the things that you don't want to do is to have the employee coming back day after day after day after day because he or she doesn't have anything to do. You can't help some of that, but you can help the employee plan for his or her next steps. References. We talked about this before. company needs to have a policy about references, how they'll give references out, what type of information they will provide. And we have to be careful about that. If there is derogatory information, it has to be given out. I went through a couple, and most of the time we would only give the information I talked about, because, and whether that was good, bad, or indifferent, I don't know. We never did have an incident where somebody was a miscreant that would cause mischief someplace else. But occasionally I was asked, would you hire this employee again? And if the answer was no, that's what I would say. And if the answer was yes, that's what I would say. So I tried to be as honest as possible. The final topic is outsourcing. This is always a contentious issue. Usually outsourcing means that jobs are going outside the United States, so we have to think about that. We have to be concerned about that. And usually they're going to countries where there are lower wages. One of the things we have to understand, now I'm not telling you I'm in favor of outsourcing, but one of the things we have to understand is if a product is being made with a lot of labor, labor intensive, that we're not going to keep those jobs in the United States because we pay our employees much higher salaries. Like Nike found out that it was good at promotion, and it was good at marketing, et cetera, but it was not good at manufacturing. And so it outsourced its manufacturing piece. Now, Nike did run into some problems when it was found to be running a sweatshop, outsourced to running sweatshops, excuse me. But they corrected that, and Nike did take a big hit and a very serious black eye for that, but they did correct that. All outsourcing, as I mentioned before, is not bad. It doesn't mean all U.S. jobs are lost. The example I've given here is that Procter & Gamble decided it was ill-equipped to handle its information management functions, and so it outsourced that to Hewlett-Packard, another American company. It was a win-win situation for everyone. Hewlett-Packard got people who were schooled in information management. Procter & Gamble was able to devoid itself of a competency which was not a core competency. And the last piece of the win-win was that all the employees who worked in Procter & Gamble's information management section or department went to work for Hewlett-Packard. A further win was they didn't move from where they were. Now, human resource managers wear different hats, and they have to know what hat they have on at that particular time. They need to be proactive and not reactive. Too often, especially in the past, human resource managers were reactive and not ahead of the power curve. The last topic we want to talk about in the few minutes we have remaining is Chapter 14, which introduces an important but often neglected topic for human resource managers. That is evaluating the staffing function. We know that companies do, or they should, evaluate their training program, but what else needs to be evaluated and by what type of method? The authors state there are 3 methods that may be used to evaluate the staffing function. And remember, this course is staffing and selecting. So we need to understand about staffing. Are we getting the right people in the right jobs? And do we have a staffing plan that is adequate and meets the needs of the organization? Well, we can say, most likely, we can say yes to that. We've had the Vice President of Human Resources sit in on the executive meetings, and he or she's been able to give the data to the folks that set strategic planning, make strategic plans and have them implemented. Yeah, these are the type of these are the type of potential employees in the surrounding area. We can meet our current needs and our future needs by recruiting in this area. We do not need to go beyond this area. Or, no, we can't do that. Our traditional recruiting area is 25 miles. We're going to need to expand that to 75 miles based upon the research we found and the data that we've analyzed. We can't be successful if we stay here where we are and don't move beyond the boundaries that we have that are traditional boundaries. Yes, we can get some employees from within our traditional boundaries, but we can't get the folks that we need to move forward, to help us innovate, to help us be creative, etc., unless we expand our horizons, our recruiting horizons. The staffing function, as we know or should know, covers the entire gamut of activities for which human resource management folks are responsible to not only administer, but to implement as well. One of the things that we have to really take away from this course is, and I think the text alludes to that in many different chapters, especially when we get into recruiting, selecting, interviewing, etc., is that the human resource folks have to be on the cutting edge of what goes in, and what are not so much in what goes on in the company when it comes to recruitment, selection, staffing, and all the parts that go into that, and the things we just talked about, terminations, demotions, resignations, retirement, etc. Too often in the past, and I'm doing a little preaching here, but it's important that we get this and we see the difference. Too often in the past, the human resource management folks were reactive. They were not active. They were not part of the strategic plan or setting up the strategic plan or giving input to the strategic plan. They sat back and they reacted to what the company did instead of being there when the plans were being laid out and helping to formulate the plans. These are the kind of employees we need. This is the kind of expertise we have to look for, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, the company planners, the strategic planners should have some idea, but it's up to the human resource management folks to tell them, yeah, we can do this. No, we can't do that. And we can't do that but have an alternative plan to be able to implement to get the company where it needs to be. So the first method that the authors offer here for evaluating, if you will, the staffing function is a checklist. Now, we all should know what a checklist is. We go into Valvoline or some other standalone oil change company's franchise, Speedy Lube or something like that, and those folks have a checklist of things that they've done for your car. They check the tires, they check the radiator, they check the antifreeze, they filled the put on a new filter, drained the old oil, filled up with however many quarts of oil it needs, did some lubrication, did a few other things, checked all the fluid levels, etc. And it's a checklist. And it says, we did this and we did that. We didn't do this for whatever reason, etc. But it doesn't tell you the quality of what they did. All it says is, we did this. And it's just a check. Did you do this? Yes. Did you do that? No. Doesn't say any more than that. So if we're going to use a checklist to look at our staffing functions, it comes down to yes or no. And it's a series of questions that probably we in the Human Resource Management Office have formulated and put together, and so we have a form, and whether or not we're conducting the various functions listed. And obviously, more yeses indicate that we're doing what we're charged to do. It's important to note that this type of evaluation is not a benchmark. Rather, it is simply an internal report card. And we know that we want more pluses than we want minuses. It is useful, or can be useful. It is an easy way to compile data, but it just reports that we are following the organization's HR policies and procedures. It gives no numerical measures. So all it tells us is yes or no. It doesn't tell us how well we're doing it. It just says we are. Nothing more, nothing less. A second method adopts quantitative measures, excuse me. This method can use statistical measures. If this is the choice, an expert in statistical analysis should help develop the measurement tool so an adequate evaluation can be rendered. Not only does that person or should that person help develop the evaluation method, but he should be the one or she should be the one to analyze the results. Everybody is not well schooled in statistics and in statistical analysis. As a matter of fact, I like to say there are two people, those people who understand statistics, and there are those who don't. And in my experience, there are more in the don't category than there are in the do category. So you have to make sure that you have somebody not only design the evaluation tool, but be able to interpret the data that comes out and then turn the data into meaningful information. I say that because there is an old saying that's been around for many years. There are lies, excuse the next expression, there are damn lies, and then there are statistics. You've also probably heard that people can make almost any answer out of statistics, statistical analysis, etc. So that's why it's important to have that person not only design that, but to be able to evaluate the data and put it into meaningful information. This something can be things as it can also use a mathematical formula or mathematical formulae. It can be simple ratios, and it assists the HR department in compiling meaningful data. Now, this is not statistics here. This is based on mathematics. That may be used for both internal and external reports. This method is another type of an internal evaluation. It is an improvement over the checklist scenario, and we have either statistical analyses or numerical data to report. This method paints a clearer picture of how HR is evaluating its staffing functions. And of course, it can be taken to the board of directors, it can be taken to the senior executives, and they can see something that tells them, gives them a picture of what's being done and how it's being done because you have data there. Now, if you're going to do that, especially if you use statistical analyses, you should develop a pie chart or something of that goes along with it and have some kind of a short, emphasis on the word short, PowerPoint presentation to show what you're doing and how you're doing and what it means. You can't just go to the executive committee, if you will, which is headed up by the CEO and several other executive officers, and say, here this is, without giving them a good picture and letting them know what the data mean. Yeah, numerical should tell them, statistical should tell them, but it's always good for someone in your office to be able, who's conversant with this, who understands it, who can answer questions that are raised by both what they see, what they believe the data say, and how the data is interpreted, who has some understanding of that and is articulate and can give that back to them. Now, both of those methods are good, as I talked about before. I mean, the checklist is good because it tells you, yes, we're doing this, no, we're not doing that. It should give you some idea what you need to do if you have a lot of notes. This is also good because it gives you some empirical data with numbers to be able to back up what you're finding or to give meaning to what you're finding through some type of statistical analysis or numbers. But these are internal reports. They're generated by the folks in human resource management for the company. They don't go outside the company. The final method is benchmarking an organization's internal data. So you would do this in some fashion based upon the statistical analysis or the mathematical formula used against external companies. Normally speaking, when a company decides to benchmark, it benchmarks its practices and procedures and products and quality, et cetera, against a leader in a particular industry. This is the newest method, and an organization may choose a competitor or other entity to use as its benchmark. I would say if you choose another entity, and that should really be another organization, there should be good and cogent reasons for not using someone in a competitor or someone who is not a direct competitor but is in the same industry. There should be good reasons why you chose not to do that. And of course, you should be concerned about that, because if you have somebody else that does a better job of evaluating their staffing procedures than someone within your industry, some organization within your industry, then you're better off using that. That would be considered a leader in the field of HR staffing evaluation. Usually companies choose the outstanding organization within the industry, as I mentioned before, as the benchmark. Two obvious uses for, pardon me, for benchmarking are in absentee and turnover rates. Companies can benchmark against the data compiled by the Bureau of National Affairs, which provides industry-wide data. It's the same organization I talked about earlier when I talked about turnover rates. Now, remember, they're only going to give you two: absentee rate and turnover rate. They're not going to give you other areas that you may feel are necessary to evaluate. Benchmarking is viewed as a superior evaluation method, but as usual, with anything, it has both advantages and disadvantages. Some advantages are it uses quantifiable data which senior management can readily understand. So here you're using your internal quantifiable data against someone else's internal quantifiable data. And you're saying, okay, that's our benchmark. We either want to get to what company XYZ is doing, or we want to exceed what company XYZ is doing, or we're meeting what company XYZ is doing, or we're falling below that, and here are the recommendations for approval, and these are the things we're implementing to improve our evaluation and improve our practices. Use the industry leader or a comparable other. And again, when you do that, the senior executives are going to understand that, and they're going to applaud that effort, even though you may find that you're falling below what you where you want to be based upon an industry standard or a leader in the field. They're going to applaud your effort. They may tell you they need to come up to snuff, but they're going to applaud that effort. It can provide a clearer picture of the costs associated with HR. That's very important. There are two different types of departments within an organization. There are those that are known as profit centers because they generate a profit. And there are those that are known as cost centers because it costs the company to have them. HR has continually fallen in the cost center because people cannot always see or understand easily how HR is providing a value and is actually a profit center by hiring the right employees, etc. And of course, it can be seen as a motivator for HR to improve and excel its staffing activities and evaluation thereof. Pardon me. The disadvantages include to obtain reliable results, the organization must be compared to many others. Yeah, that's probably true. You may not be able to do a real valid comparison if it's only done to one other organization. Costs to undertake this method of evaluation may be prohibitive. The amount of time needed to obtain good comparative data may be beyond the scope of the HR department, or not only beyond the scope of the HR department, be sort of out of date by the time they get it. So you want information to be current, so you can make sure you're doing what you're doing is current, and that may not be always easy to obtain. Regardless of the evaluation method selected, it is imperative for HR to have a report card ready at all times. This is nothing different than the production sector of the business. They have some type of report card. It's nothing different than the people who are running quality control, etc. There has to be some kind of benchmark, some kind of data that can be given to upper management, so you can show what you're doing and how you're doing it, and what methods you have or what programs you've implemented to improve performance. The reason is that many organizations view HR as a cost center, as I've alluded to before. And when they see that, that's the first thing they think about. HR doesn't bring nothing in, or no profit comes from HR. And that's why it's important that HR take the lead in these type things, and that HR be part of the strategic planning process. Because otherwise, people think, oh, well, they're just the forms pushers. So senior management simply doesn't understand HR's value, and HR cannot, in many cases, articulate its importance to an organization's success. So it's imperative that the HR function be both effective and efficient. The staffing function, for which is HR's responsibility, is the lifeblood of any organization. Organizational success depends upon having the right employees in the right place with the right skills, ability, knowledge, etc. And HR has to have a contingency plan to ensure any employment changes can be met. Big challenges for human resource management. Too often in the past, we've thought about HR, etc., and to not think of them as being at the table. Now, I want to take just a second here, and I hope you do take the opportunity to watch the video. And that is to tell you to be sure that you pay careful attention to the federal court case of EEOC versus Chrysler Corporation. This revolves around ADA. Please make sure that you read the ADA portions, or ADA is addressed in the text. Too often I've seen students have misread what they've seen about ADA. And this is an ADA case. It's a very important case, at least as far as I'm concerned. And it's very important to pay attention to how the case is built and to the questions that are posed. Now, everyone should have their posting done by 11:50 p.m. tonight. I will respond to you and provide feedback, and then I will turn on the court's decision in this case, so you can read it and see what the court had to say. Obviously, I will give you feedback based upon my memory, how you've answered the questions that are posed before I turn on the feedback, before I turn on the case, so that you can read it. I don't refer to the case ahead of time. I do know the answer, and yeah, I can cheat. I won't do that. I will respond to what you post without referring to the case, even though I do know the answer. I try to respond to what you posted. I do encourage you to interact with each other. It's very important. That's how we learn. We learn from others' perspectives and the way other people judge various and sundry things that take place. But again, I encourage you to make sure that you read the ADA portion. I think it's, matter of fact, I'll take a second here and look that up. I think it's on page pages 25 through 28 of the text. I might have missed that by a couple of pages. Yeah, ADA starts on page 31. Didn't miss it by a few sections, and concludes on page 32. So make sure you read that before you decide to answer the questions that are posed. Make sure you have a good grounding in what ADA says. Remember, ADA talks about reasonable accommodations, and if accommodations requested are not reasonable, then they don't have to be implemented by a company, no matter its size. But this particular case has some interesting twists and turns in it, and I think it's something that is not unusual to find in the workforce. Well, we are almost at 6:29. We spent the last 2 academic hours speaking about selection, and then some of the staffing things that HR must go through, and then evaluating their staffing functions. So pardon me, I thank you for your attendance. I look forward to speaking to you next week. Thank you. Boy.